Okay. Check. Good afternoon, everyone. One of the core themes of this conference, it's not just the potential of psychedelic medicines, but the freedom to explore them in safe, meaningful, and spiritually authentic ways. In the United States, our legal framework for religious freedom has opened and continues to open important doors for communities seeking to work with these substances in ceremony and spiritual practice. Today, we're honored to have with us Tarin Hale, a leading legal voice in this space. His work has been at the intersection of law, faith, and human rights, which has helped shape how our society understands religious protections when it comes to entheogens and sacramental practices. Tarin has been practicing law for over 30 years, primarily in the areas of civil litigation and criminal defense. His claim to fame was the 1999 criminal defense of a 12-year-old charged with murder based on a false confession. The events of that case led to a midlife crisis with severe depression in 2010. Tarin credits shamanic plant medicine with curing his depression and saving his life. Since then, Tarin has focused his law practice on advocacy and defense of entheogenic plants. In 2022, Tarin helped a nurse in Indiana who was facing 25 years in prison for growing psilocybin mushrooms to relieve her own treatment-resistant depression. In 2023, Tarin helped a Boston area policeman become the first active duty officer to attend a psychedelic church with permission. Tarin continues to help members of the psychedelic community facing criminal charges and advising consulting on religious protections. We're going to explore the opportunities, the challenges, and the future of religious freedom as it relates to psychedelic use. This conversation is about more than law. It's about the principles of spiritual sovereignty and the rights of communities to pursue healing and connection. With that said, help me welcome Tarin.
Thank you, Josh, for the introduction. I'm still relatively new to this. This is the third time I've spoken, and each time I speak, it gets more personal. It's kind of a different experience for an attorney. Typically, I have a client that I can advocate for, and here it's just me. I want to just kind of elaborate a little bit more on what Josh said about my experience. In the midst of my despair of a severe depression in 2009, I sat with a shamanic plant medicine ceremony. And it was really something completely out of left field for me to even consider at the time. But when you're contemplating suicide, there's not much that you should not consider as an option. That ceremony saved my life. And from that ceremony and the several thereafter, I found meaning and purpose for my life, and it cured my depression. These experiences showed me, from my perspective, how I was looking at life upside down, seeing scarcity when there was abundance. And it was clear to me that during these ceremonies, I was in direct communication with the intelligence of the universe, the Creator, and God. And it was clear to me that attending these ceremonies and my new understanding of life that came from them, that became my religion. You hear a lot of stories about people having PTSD, depression, anxiety, and they have a plant medicine experience, and it helped them. What I'm really interested in is the it. What is the it that helped them? And when you talk to people, and when you look at the research, that it is the connection to God. It's the connection to a higher source. It's a connection to an understanding of the universe that comes through these experiences. And that is a religious experience. The right to practice your religious freely is a cornerstone principle of this country, recognized by the founding fathers to be an unalienable right. That right is spelled out in the First Amendment to our Constitution. Oh, I'm upside down. Sorry about that. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And I know it's difficult for some people to use the word religion, but let's look at the amendment. Prohibiting the free exercise of religion, not of spirituality, not wellness centers, not therapy, it's religious freedom. Going further, when the U.S. Supreme Court found that a Native American's use of peyote was not protected under the First Amendment from employment discrimination, Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 to affirm the protection of religious freedom from government interference, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It also recognized the unalienable right to practice religion. It provides that the government shall not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, even if the burden results from a rule of general applicability, which is what they found in the employment case, except where the government may substantially burden if there is in furtherance of a compelling government interest and the least restrictive means. And a person whose religious exercise has been burdened by the violation can assert that claim as a proactively or defense in a judicial proceeding. So that's basically the two prongs of Religious Freedom Restoration Act, is that if you're being harassed by the government, you can sue them. If you're being charged with a crime, you can defend yourself under religious freedom. Some of you may know that the UDV case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court, use of ayahuasca. And they found this U.S. Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision in 2006, found under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that the UDV, use of ayahuasca, was protected and the government had to stop harassing them by intercepting their sacrament. These are real rights. These are not ambiguities. These are the intention. And it's also understanding that it's the religious freedom. It's not the freedom to participate in organized religion. It's not the freedom to pick a choice of a mainstream religion. It is an individual experience of communicating with their Creator. Since my experience back in 2009, my work is focused on the legal use of psychedelics in the context of religious freedom and also exploring decriminalization laws. I've attended MAP since 2011, and when there were basically 2 lawyers there practicing this area. And as part of my practice, I consult with people, facilitators, and groups about their religious rights in using psychedelic compounds in a religious context, individually or in forming churches. I also help people facing criminal charges related to possession of compounds, and I often have this resistance. People always ask me, well, do we have to use the word religion? Do we have to call it a church? Do we have to use the word God? And sometimes people say this, ask me, or they tell me, I get it. We're going to pretend to be a church. While I can appreciate that many people have had bad experiences with mainstream religions and culture and churches and ministers, I do not believe we should be afraid or timid in using the proper terms from our culture to communicate what we are doing, nor shy away from the fundamental experiences with these compounds. There is no pretense here for me. I believe the work is religious, and we need to use the words of our culture to explain to others and to assist ourselves in understanding what we are experiencing. This is my religion. This is my connection to God. In understanding this, I've been trying to come up with a little different scenario or the little stories. And I sometimes hear people talking like, I took this compound and it cured my depression. And so I had this little vision, like a little Pac-Man, like here comes psychedelic and it's going to eat my depression. That's not how it works. This isn't a medicine like an antibiotic that goes in and attacks some kind of disease in you. This medicine, these compounds, entheogenic compounds, bring forth a connection to a higher source. And I really wish we could all support that and connect with that as the main thing. It's not a secondary thing. We're not practicing medicine. They accuse us of practicing medicine without a license. I accuse them of practicing religion without a license. One of the cases you may have heard about is Jessica. And my involvement with her case was a miracle unto itself. I was traveling at the time quite a bit, and I came home, and there was 100 of emails. I went through these 100 of emails, and I found this story about a nurse in Indiana facing 10 years in prison for growing mushrooms. I reached out to her. We had a first conversation. She said, well, thank you for calling. I appreciate your support, but I'm going to work on my nursing degree while I'm in prison. I said, no, you're going to send me all your materials, and we're going to make a change. I intervened. We fired her lawyer, who had arranged a plea deal for her to serve 10 years in prison. I brought experts from across the country, including Jim Fadiman, and we convinced the court to drop it down to a single case of possession, 90 days house arrest. If you don't know, Jessica is in the front row here. Since then, she's established, co-founded the Decriminalization Northwest Arkansas program. Had we had the opportunity, in the letter she wrote for her pre-sentence investigation, she talked about an untreatable 20 years experience with anxiety and depression. And she talked about finding the oneness and finding that connection to spirit. We could not argue that as given the circumstances. We were pleased enough with the 90 days house arrest that we didn't feel the need to push the court. At the same time, I'm working on Jessica, trying to keep her out of prison. I'm contacted by a police officer out of Boston, Sarko Gagarian. He met Rick Doblin at the Miami Chief of Police convention, was invited to come in and participate with an MDMA session. He had an undergraduate studies in religion, had always had a curiosity about religion, and his MDMA experience opened him up to that and wanted to continue it. We petitioned his department for him to attend a psychedelic church. He's now the only, as far as I know, first and only active duty police officer to have permission from his department to attend a psychedelic church. I'll wrap this up and then go into some questions, but it's just clear to me that the people who are exploring this in a way to make their lives better, reduce suffering, and reconnect with life itself in a positive way are not criminals, and we should not be treated as such. We need to be more proactive in understanding our religious freedom. We need to get over the stigma about the fact of calling it religion and God, to understand that those are the principles. When you read Immortality Key by Brian Morescu, when you understand the origin of religion is our connection to spirit, and it was taken from us by an organization that became the middleman to decide whether or not we got to heaven. And then as we conquered other countries or other nations, we ripped them from their spiritual beliefs and tried to indoctrinate them into this middleman position. It's not religion the enemy. And we can really need to focus on reuniting, renaming, and accepting this as our spiritual path. Thank you. I'll end with this one last thing. Because of all the arguments you get into, I get into with people about religion. I made up this Venn diagram. I borrowed it, and it's like, here you are. We're in the middle. We've got religion, we got philosophy, we got science. We're exploring our nature. I don't believe we're human. I believe we are spiritual beings having a human experience, and we're reconnecting with that spiritual sense of us through these experiences. And they're rooted in the realm of asking these ultimate questions. Who are we? What are we? Where do we come from? And those questions intertwine between religion and philosophy. Philosophy will say that they're focused on reason and intellect. Religion will say they're focused on belief and mysticism. And science is the realm of explaining to us the fact that these compounds are not compounds that are making us see pink elephants fly around the room. We're connecting with this consciousness. Thank you.
Brother Tarin, always good to spend time with you. I'd like to start out with some foundation and context questions. Some of this you touched on. How does the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, actually work in practice for groups seeking protection?
This is interesting. So we're after the you had the UDV case, the Supreme Court case in 2006. Basically, in 1999, the UDV and the Santo Daime churches were both raided at the same time. The UDV, they were raided with SWAT teams, automatic weapons. They were taken in for questioning briefly, and then nothing happened. The UDV, under the first prong of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, said we're being harassed. They sued the government. Santo Daime filed a Me Too case a couple of years later. That was the establishment. That was the start of using RFRA proactively. In response to the Santo Daime case, the DEA came up with a procedure to file an application for an exemption. They said, tell us who you are, where you are, what you're doing, who you're doing it with, and then stop doing it while we review your application. This procedure was audited by the Government Accounting Office, and they published a report in May of 24 and found that out of the 24 applicants for this exemption, 0 had been granted. They found specifically 8 of them were mushroom churches, and the report outlined the sacred use of mushrooms and basically the validity of what they should be looking at. We've had 2 other churches file for harassment, Eagle and the Condor and Celestial Heart. They both filed. They're both ayahuasca churches, very well financed, and they were successful in negotiating settlements with the DEA, similar to what the UDV and the Santo Daime received. There's a third church called Gaia. They're the first one to file an application to be approved. Again, it's an ayahuasca church, and but they're a dry church. They were proposing what they would do in terms of under the guidelines, and they were accepted, and that was just last year. That's, on the other hand, we're also seeing the criminal cases. And in the criminal cases, we're trying to raise as a defense religious freedom. The Celestial Heart was quasi-criminal, but it mostly was focused on the civil action. The difficulty has been that RFRA is a federal law, and so it doesn't apply to state law. There are states that have passed state RFRA cases or statutes, and there are some states that found that their constitution was stronger and didn't need it. So what's happening, though, is that we've had cases that are brought in state court, and we're trying to assert the RFRA claim, but it's been very challenging. And then it's also backed up against the criminal punishments. When you're facing 20 to 30 years in prison, it's really difficult to go through all the work of an expense of defending yourself under RFRA when the prosecutor offers you something like probation. So we've kind of been stymied in terms of really flexing our muscle with it. But I really believe that we need civil litigation to take this law and make this law more practical and applicable to us. I think we need cases like Jessica's, where we can establish that we have these rights. And we're not asking the DEA for permission. We're demanding our rights. And I think we're looking forward to this. There's a new case, relatively new case out of Utah I would encourage you all to take a look at. Very interesting. A gentleman by the name of Bridger Jensen started a mushroom church in 23, invited the city and county officials to come visit his church. They refused. In 2024, they got a search warrant, took his mushrooms and his scripture for his church. And before they could file criminal charges, he went to court and filed an injunction to get his mushrooms back. The case was remanded into federal court. The federal court had a hearing in December of 24, and the judge heard Bridger talk about his church, and several members of his church testified, and the judge said, give him back his mushrooms. He has sincerity of belief.
I had another foundation and context question, but you really knocked it out already. So I'm gonna move on to some practical guidance questions. If someone wanted to start or join a spiritual community that uses psychedelics, what steps should they take to be on solid legal ground?
What I've seen is there are some lawyers and not lawyers who have been somewhat selling churches. The idea that you can hire them for $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, you can fill in the blanks, and then you are now a church, and you can get your 501c3. And I've been contacted by these people firsthand, and I've asked them, well, what's your religion? And they said, I don't know. The lawyer wrote down something. That is not going to protect you. It's been very troubling for me to hear this, because I believe in the sincerity of it. I don't believe we need to pretend to be a church. I believe we need to understand and appreciate what we're doing and be able to articulate it in a courtroom before a judge and jury. And so when I work with people, that's where I start with. I start with the idea that whoever you are, that your leader needs to be prepared to testify and to explain specifically the religious aspects of your practice. And once you can identify that, and once you can really embrace that, and embrace that oftentimes within your practice itself, essentially there's only one answer to why you started a church. And it's the same answer that Master Iranu gave when he founded the Santo Daime, because God told me to. And from the understanding of your practice, then you build out the other elements of it. You can articulate your practices, beliefs, you can instill your safety procedures and protocols, but you have to start with the core understanding of what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that's what I would be looking for in really protecting the practice.
So with that said, then, what are some of the most common mistakes you've seen groups make that put them at risk legally?
We had the Soul Quest case down in Florida was a good example of where Chris Young had a story about how he came into doing the practice. And he had, I believe, a sincerity about it. But when he filed for the exemption, in 2016, the DEA sent a letter to Ayahuasca USA in Washington State, and they sent a letter to Chris Young in Florida, cease and desist. They were both doing ayahuasca churches. So in 1999, they raided churches with automatic weapons and SWAT teams. In 2016, they sent a letter. So we made some progress. Chris Young, Trinity was the leader of the Ayahuasca USA. He filed a pro se brief, and then he went to Mexico, as I understand it. Chris Young hired a lawyer, and he filed an application. He threw in the kitchen sink. He threw in a document called the Ayahuasca Manifesto, which is a document outlining proper practices and procedures with ayahuasca, written anonymously by a gentleman who I met in 2017 at MAPS, who Chris did not know had written it. And he said that in his plethora of documents of establishing the sincerity of his church, he said that was the doctrine. And when the DEA came in and interviewed everybody, none of them ever heard of it or practiced it. It's this lack of sincerity. You can't just write up a bunch of pretty words and hold that document up and say, here, this is my church. You have to walk the walk. You have to really connect with it. And I'm telling you, there is plenty to connect with. This is not something that you have to fabricate. You have to examine what you're doing and to connect with it.
Thank you. So sincerity of belief seems to be the focal point, one of the main ones. For demonstrating that, so for demonstrating sincerity of belief, how important is documentation, such as having a written mission, theology, or a set of practices?
Number one, when I work with people, the first thing I'm looking for is the history. Why are you doing this? And that's important to write out. Now, first of all, you're showing the fact that you didn't just make this up after the fact. And two, as you sit down and write out your history, I believe, you will find these connections that you had forgotten. How did you get to your first ceremony? What were the circumstances that brought you there? And all those little coincidences, as they sometimes call them, that brought you into this experience, that led you to the path of wanting to serve. These are important to draw out. You're filling in, it's like a coloring book, you're filling in the story. And that's really critical. Once you have that, then the other documents, I believe, follow. You'll understand that from that central standpoint of sincerity, how should we structure the church? What are the safety protocols we should put in place? What's the doctrine that we're working with? Understand this. Go forward and read the Utah case. Bridger Jensen was raised as a Mormon. He was a missionary. He understands religious discussion, philosophy, and words. And he put together a church whose practice was essentially coming in, sitting on a couch, taking the medicine, and having him guide you through it. And that, a federal district court judge said, that's religion, that's a church, and give him back his mushrooms. Because it's a sincerity that came through. He had the other structure built in. But the key element of his structure was the fact that there was no dogma, the fact that he would not tell people what to believe. That was what the experience was all about. And that was found to be supported.
Now for some challenges and risks questions. How are courts determining what constitutes a sincere religious belief versus recreational use? It's funny in a way because this is the one question they do not want to touch. I was involved with a case recently where that was like the judge kind of put that front and center and basically said, we're not going to talk about it. Judges do not want to try to get into your head to decide what is sincere or not. And let me tell you, the Catholic Church, the Baptist Church, and any of these churches don't want their beliefs challenged under cross-examination either. And they will not let the courts do that. So the sincerity of belief is basically by absence. If you're selling mushrooms and making $1 million, that doesn't seem sincere. If you're running a business and calling it a church, it's not sincere. So that's how they kind of backdoor it, not attacking it directly. And then and one of the problems we have is that in the 80s and 90s, we had a lot of bad case law involving cannabis. And if you look at those cases, basically the judge started the case with, I hate marijuana and potheads, and I am not going to find that this is a religious experience. You're going to go to jail. And so there's bad case law where they just they couldn't do it. They just could not stomach the idea of marijuana. So we have to overcome that.
And that's where what I believe one of the arguments we're presenting going forward. I am not against the medical model as it does the research. It just don't stop there. It's a spiritual experience and allow the spiritual experience to be. But what the medical research is showing is, again, we're not experiencing pink elephants. If you look at Rick Strassman in the Spirit Molecule book, when he did his research, people were talking to God. We just had the release of the clergy study that just came out of, I believe, John Hopkins with the 24 clergy, who identified this. 96% of them identified their experience as being religious. So that's supporting us in the fact that the sincerity of this is consistent with the science.
So what risks remain then, even for groups who believe they are protected under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act? Because constitutionally we are protected, it's our right. But what risk remain there?
I always tell people, don't ever ask me what's the worst thing that can happen. The worst thing that could happen is uncalculable. But at the same time, I look at what happened. I still, marvel at rock and roll and Hollywood and all the drugs that went through there, and nobody ever got charged. A friend of mine relayed that he went backstage to a concert back in the 80s, and there was like a pound of cocaine that everybody was playing off of. And if I had been there, I would have freaked out. I'd be like, oh my gosh. Like, oh, and it's also sadly though, is the fact that our drug laws have been racist. And when a black man is sitting on the corner selling dime bags of weed, that's a crime. But I swear, if you call up the police and say, hey, there's a bunch of wealthy white people next door and I think they're doing drugs, they would go through their book and like, well, we don't, actually, that's not illegal in our book. They've never been charged. So we're in this ambiguity world where the risk could be very great if you're in a suspect class. We have not seen it enforced against anybody. SoulQuest, which filed their application, denied based on lack of sincerity, continued to practice. A person died there related to a combo experience, never faced criminal charges. Eagle and the Condor filed for under harassment because their sacrament was being intercepted, unknown, never faced criminal charges. So we're in the ambiguity area. I think what we hear is that the DA doesn't know what to do. They really don't. We're trying to, and that's why I think we need the litigation to kind of get us there. I respect decrim. I think it's a great opportunity to kind of lessen the impact of some of this, but we really need positive case law that says leave us alone.
So how do federal protections interact then with state or local laws that may still criminalize these substances?
This is a goofy one. It's hard and goofy. It's hard in the sense that I have been involved in cases where the federal government has intercepted ayahuasca shipping through basically Miami, and the federal government doesn't want to prosecute. They will hand off to a local sheriff or police to prosecute. If it was prosecuted federally, we've got RFRA right away. RFRA, understand, RFRA stands for the proposition that you can use a Scheduled I compound for a religious ceremony and you're protected. It's like the original decrim statute. But when you go into state law, now you got to find out whether or not they have a RFRA claim. State law, you're dealing with state judges who are elected or county judges who are elected officials. They're not sure they want to run for re-election as being the one who let drugs go. And so it's been very challenging. And then I'm up against 20, 30-year sentences. And so it's been very frustrating. We recently have had, 2 at least I'm aware of, federal charges, and we're going to kind of see where that lands under RFRA, but it's very complicated between the state and trying to prove this under state law. It gets basically it gets expensive. It gets expensive for lawyers and experts. So we're kind of stymied that way. That's why we need decrim in certain areas. If you're in a decrim area, I really want to encourage people to bring out religious exemption so we can fight it at that level and not face years in prison, but show the sincerity. One of my biggest disappointments that I had was all those 1980 and 90 cases where everyone said that they were using cannabis for religion, and then Denver decriminalized cannabis, but we didn't see any churches pop up. Maybe, were they sincere?
I want to move on to some broader implication questions. Do you see momentum for broader recognition of psychedelic religious practices, or is the legal environment still very unclear?
There's a growing momentum. Again, the Utah, I cannot emphasize how important the Utah case is. It really is astounding. And this is one of the key elements that I didn't share yet. One of the key elements of that case was that the district judge did not rely upon RFRA, but she actually imposed protection under the First Amendment. The First Amendment applies, our amendments apply to every state, county, and city. So if this, and that's why they had to pass RFRA, because they had to pass a federal statute. But if it's under the Constitution, then it applies to every state, and it could be a tremendous advantage that we have going forward. We also believe that the Smith case, which was the peyote case, which caused RFRA, we believe that the Supreme Court really wants to reverse its decision and say it was First Amendment, and that will also give us federal protection. We also have heard there's inklings within the new administration, very favorable towards psychedelics and the work that's being done. It's not sure how they're going to implement any policies, but it is favorable. And it's just a growing support. But I think there's momentum there. But what I would like to see is I'd like to see more religious institutions with sincere beliefs and practices who can articulate their basis and file civil cases in support.
So how might ongoing decriminalization or medicalization efforts affect religious freedom protections, whether it's positively or negatively?
Like I said before, medicalization, I appreciate the research, but I do not want this limited to a medical diagnosis, treatment, and insurance, and $10,000 that they're talking about for a single MDMA experience. What I say is, look, if you want to go do Snoop Dogg, DMT, you go ahead. I want there to be reasonable access to these compounds through the religious exemption that's there.
All right, so for some forward-looking questions here. From your perspective, what is the most important precedent or decision yet to be made in this area?
I think I've already spoiled that. It's the Utah case right now. It really is a matter of seeing how far that goes. I got a message yesterday that supposedly the prosecutor wants to appeal because he says drugs are bad. Psilocybin is a Schedule I substance that has no medical use and is dangerous, and he needs to protect the population of Utah. And I just don't think that's going to fly very far, hopefully. It is the leading case that we're all watching and see where it goes. Ideally, we're going to see more. And that's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping to really create a movement of civil litigation like we saw in the civil rights movement. These laws do not act upon themselves. In a little vision that I have, it's like there's a border out there. There's a battlefield out there. We are miles behind. We have got to go and take the rights that we have and embrace them. And need to get up and run. We don't need to be crawling around back here in fear. We've got to overcome this fear in some way.
So what gives you hope for the future of religious freedom and psychedelics in America? Like, for yourself, being so close to this, what gives you hope? There's a synergy that is building.
No doubt. For me, I've been doing this 15 years, and I mean, there's a synergy that's happening now that's stronger than it's ever been. You know, the hope is the fact that there is no place else to go. This is the opening. This is a fundamental right, and that's really the message that I'm trying to get people to understand. It's the First Amendment to our Constitution. It really is something that we need to embrace, and I believe that we are on a very sad trajectory without it. I really believe, there have been a lot of lawyers who did cannabis work stepping into the psychedelic work. They're thinking of it as this administrative structure. They do not understand the fundamental conscious changing element involved with the psychedelics. It's not like cannabis. This is not just a temporary fix. This is a conscious shift. And that's what I have the hope for.
So this next question, being in the space, you know people who talk about putting a church together to have that framework of protection, and we're putting this church together and now we're protected. And so you hear a lot of that talk in the space. So Religious Freedom Restoration Act, it may often be interpreted that it only applies to organized or these recognized religious institutions called churches. But under U.S. law, do individual citizens also have protection for their religious practices without needing to create a formal church structure to practice medicine?
Well, that reminds me of something. Do not let my enthusiasm of where we're going be misinterpreted as necessary confidence that we're going to get there soon. Yes, the First Amendment applies to individuals and for a religious exercise. And I think that if you can, as people articulate it clearly, and that's what's been missing in the law. The cases that I read have been not good as in terms of a defendant articulating the spiritual, religious nature of what they're doing. They're oftentimes people, and to be fair, they're oftentimes marginalized people to begin with, first of all, because they're being charged, because the white middle class, upper middle class person doesn't get charged with these crimes. And then there are also people who have suffered trauma, which is why they were going for this experience too. And so we don't have good case law in that respect. What was the other part of the question?
Well, it was more around just RFRA being interpreted as needing to have a framework of a church to be protected when us individuals and citizens who may be practicing medicine work for healing purposes can also be protected under that same law without a church.
Yeah, like I said, I talk to facilitators and individuals all the time. I was at MAPS 2 years ago, and I talked to a facilitator working with medicine. I said, "Are you doing it under religious protection?" And she said, "No, I can't afford it." I talked to a lawyer. They said it was going to be $5,000. I said, "No, that's not true. Your religious protection is the sincerity in which you are practicing it. If you are doing a circle of 10 people and there's a knock on the door, each one of those people will be taken outside and asked, 'What are you doing in there?' And they're going to answer that officer with whatever you tell them. If you are telling them and holding this in sacredness as part of your religious practice, that's the only thing that they can share. And if you do it with sincerity, I talked to one person. They said, "Oh, if that ever happens, I'm going to tell them to say that we're doing yoga." You know what that person is going to tell the police? She told me to say we're doing yoga. You got it. This is not difficult. I know some people are like, "I can't believe a lawyer's telling me to tell the truth." Yeah, that's where your freedom is. When you tell the truth, you're free, and that, I believe, is what this work is all about. I believe fundamentally that the work with these compounds is to free us from the fear that we have been indoctrinated into, that we can find a way to speak our truth, to speak our voice, and to have integrity behind it. And as we do this, we're going to take it. Have a little passion.
We invite that. If you could give one piece of advice to our community here today about protecting themselves legally while pursuing spiritual work, what would it be?
I feel like a little bit of a broken record here. It is the sincerity of belief. It's really understanding religion. I mean, that is absolutely where I would start. I mean, I would get Webster's, get whatever dictionary you need, and look at these words. Look at the founding fathers. Our religious freedom is my vision of religious freedom is the fact that as a species, humanity landed on this rock, like from some kind of craft, and nobody knows where to go. Nobody knows what happens to us. We're all just trying to figure it out for ourselves. And we're running out. The program is coming to an end. Our supplies are running out. And religious freedom is the idea that if you have a dream and it says, go north, go north. We want you to follow any kind of guidance that you get because maybe you'll be the one to survive. And maybe you're the one who can share it with the rest of us. And as long as you don't take anybody else at gunpoint or force them to do it, let them be free to do that. And that is what our founding fathers really talk about. There's a Mack case called Mack out of New Hampshire. And the New Hampshire Supreme Court, I believe the Supreme Court, articulates this belief of our founding fathers. And when they found that the New Hampshire Constitution was stronger than the U.S. Constitution in affirming religious freedom. Religious freedom is an unalienable right. That means it's a right that cannot be taken away by government. Why? Why is it so important? Because nobody knows. And we all should be free to have our own experience with Creator. We should be free to have direct experience, which is what's provided for in using these compounds, and to come up with our own understanding of life, meaning, and prosperity.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I want to take some time here to open it up to our community, to our attendees here. Any questions that you may have for Tarin?
Number one, you said for religious organizations that are already doing this, you said file a civil case of support. What does that mean?
Well, to be clear, you can't file a civil case in support unless you're being harassed. So that is a limitation. That's what I showed on the slide there. You have to be harassed. There is no procedure for you to get certification from somebody other than this DEA guidance procedure, which most of the lawyers are telling you don't bother with because it's too much exposure. To call the DEA and say, here, I'm doing this, here's my address, here are the people involved, is not a first move that I would recommend of anybody. If you're being harassed, if there's somehow government harassment, then you can file the case. Now, here's the difference, though. The difference is the fact that literally there was a case in which the church filed against the DA, said, I'm afraid of being sued. I'm afraid of being charged. And the DEA came to court, the government came to court and said, that's not possible. We have not charged anybody in 40 years. So you cannot be in fear of it. I call it the right turn on red. You can't, or a self-defense. You can't go to court and have the judge say, oh, if I turn right on red, am I protected? And it depends. You have to, so it's the same thing. You can't, self-defense, you have to prove it by the elements of it. But here's the difference. In this case that's existing, where the federal government went after this woman for importing ayahuasca, they broke that promise. And so now you can be under threat. You can be in fear, and I think you might have standing to go ahead and file that case, and that's what we're looking for. I'm looking for churches that are established who are ready to endure the cost and the mental stress of the litigation so that we can move the ball forward.
Good question.
I understand, and in Jessica's case, that's what happened, and it was worse in Indiana because I gotta be careful with my words here, unfriendly person wrote a letter to the nursing board, said, I read about this case where this nurse was doing drugs, and I think she should be punished. And based upon that letter, without any firsthand experience with Jessica, they went forward with a charge, and so it's significant. So that's why when Sarko came to me and said, I want to have these experiences, and I don't want to lose my job, then that's when we got permission. And I was very disappointed. Actually, we wrote a letter. The experts in her case wrote a letter against them, saying, how dare you? How dare a medical group of people who should know better, who should know that these compounds were made illegal without any scientific proof of any danger. And as we examine the danger of compounds, the number one danger is alcohol, and it's legal and available. And it's outrageous. And so, but in terms of your medical board, I would petition for permission and say, look, this is what I want to do. What we want to get it to is the point where, and this is what we did with Sarko. We're asking permission, but if you deny it, we're going to sue you because you've now violated my religious freedom. Yeah, Brian Morescu, Immortality Key. There's a wonderful, I know Joe Rogan has a little mixed history with some people, but there's a wonderful Joe Rogan program where he presents with Graham Hancock. I'm also going to suggest that you watch the Joe Rogan program with Rick Perry and attorney Brian Hubbard. This is Brian Hubbard developed an ibogaine treatment program. He came out of Kentucky. Kentucky shut it down when they changed attorney generals. He was able to land in Texas with Rick Perry. He does a program about how special ibogaine is for treatment of opioids. They spend 2 hours on it, and then in the last 15 minutes, attorney Brian Hubbard says, wait a second, before we end this, let me tell you, this work is about meeting your creator. It's about connecting yourself with God. We can talk about the medical model, we can talk about treatment, we can talk about that, but let's not lose sight of the ball. And it's a very powerful statement. And so Immortality Key talks about basically the origin of religion, and spoiler alert, it was altered states of consciousness through compounds, according to Brian. Regardless of what you may believe about that, what's more important to me is the fact that it demonstrates clearly how organized churches went after those who were using compounds. And initially it was kill the women who were responsible for the medicine holders and their daughters. And then they went to South America, kill the shaman, the vine of soul, ayahuasca, the vine of soul. The vine of life was turned into the vine of death under their interpretation. And then he says it's the same thing we did as missionaries when we went out west and met the Native Americans, and they wouldn't take the wine and wafer, and we criminalized them, criminalized their spirituality, criminalized their dance. The scheduling system isn't just unsupported by science. It's anti-religion. These compounds were known to be used for spiritual connection, and they've never accounted for it. That's ultimately where we need to go. But thank you. Some sense. I apologize. I've been talking a lot, and I can't always remember everything that I said. The Santo Daime Church was founded by Master Iranu in 1929 or so. Master Iranu was an African-Brazilian rubber tapper who was illiterate and Catholic. He was in Peru on work. He went up to the mountaintop, sat with a shaman, and the woman of the forest came to his vision and told him to start a church. He came down from the mountaintop and started the Santo Daime. When did his church get legal authority? It got legal authority, I believe, when he accepted the word of God to start his church. Your religious sincerity is based upon the sincerity of your religious faith and practice. And that's why it's fairly simple thing in terms of just outlining that. Why are you doing this? And this is why it gets confusing. A lot of the people came into this work anti-religion. They were fleeing a religion. I went to a Unitarian church, and it was basically, you go there on a Saturday, and all they talked about was how much they hated the Catholic Church. I was never a Catholic, and I wasn't interested in hearing anymore. So, you have to overcome that, and you have to embrace this and own it. And yes, an individual can say, this is my religious practice. My canary in the coal mine was Steve Hupp. Steve Hupp was a multi-convicted, he was a bank robber in Kentucky. His last conviction was a shootout with the state police. He went to federal prison. He met what he called a little brown guy, was going to roll him for something, found out that he's a shaman. He learns about shamanism. He gets out of prison. He gets a bottle mailed to him labeled dog shampoo. Be careful. He says to his wife, I'm going into my shed and drink it. I'm going to come out. He came out a few days later, transformed. Decided he was going to serve this. He went on the internet, got some recipes, started serving it to his ex-con and drug addict friends. And because if it killed them, no one would care, and it didn't. They transformed their lives. And from those experiences, he created a church, Kentucky Ayahuasca. The church was IAQuest. This man was on national television 8 years ago, national television, telling people, this is my practice. This is Kentucky Ayahuasca. I've never been to South America, he says. I'm not going to South America. This is my practice. He passed away, unfortunately, in March of last year, but he was he was adamant about it. They never touched him. He said, if I ever get a letter, Tarin, I'm going to burn it. And then he said, well, no, I'll mail you a copy first, then I'm going to burn it. Thank you, Steve.
We may have time for one more question. Yes.
This is a nitty-gritty one. So as we've been looking at forming a church, the option to just be our own nebulous, amorphous thing of a blog, or file as 501c3, or people are suggesting that we form a private membership association. Does any of this even matter?
What's unique about churches is that under our relationship, the unalienable right, churches don't have to do anything. They are nonprofit by nature, and they don't have to follow anything with anybody. Typically they do, because if you have a building, you typically want insurance in case somebody falls down the stairs, and they have to have an entity to create that to limit your liability. A lot of the tax donations, people want you to have a 501c3 certification so that they know they can write it off. And this is the difference between like the civil suit and the criminal defense. The criminal defense, your individual right to practice and your religious freedom, it can be established without any structure whatsoever. In order to sue them and be recognized, you got to have more structure. And then how that structure goes, it kind of depends on who you are. I think of the little grandma who makes cake pie for the church social, and she sells them there, and then they're really good, and then she goes in and starts selling more, and then suddenly when she gets to the point where she has to get a commercial kitchen, okay, that changes. And so as your church builds, your response to that should be appropriate with the circumstance. But your rights exist, I believe, the moment that you accept the word from God, from consciousness to do this and can articulate in that way.
Thank you, Tarin, for helping us navigate such a complex and important area. What we've heard today makes it clear. While legal protections exist, they are not automatic. They require sincerity, integrity, and careful stewardship from communities who seek them. And beyond the legal mechanics, this is also about a broader principle. The recognition that spiritual practices are diverse and that the path to healing can take many, many forms. As we move forward, I invite everyone here to hold these lessons close. stay informed, stay intentional, and continue building communities that are rooted in respect, safety, and spiritual authenticity. Please join me one more time in offering our gratitude to Tarin for his wisdom and his work in defending the freedoms that allow us to gather in spaces like this.